A sequence began quietly, without hearings or testimony, but with a signal that would later shape how the case is understood. On a public docket, routine-looking requests to seal exhibits appeared. They referenced third parties, limited communications, and privacy protections courts see frequently. Yet embedded in those filings were dates, exhibit numbers, and timing markers that would later intersect with nearly every disputed phase of the case. What appeared procedural was already influencing the record. Away from headlines, a quieter consequence followed. Exhibits tied to February, April, and May were flagged for permanent sealing. Some of those materials were already referenced on the timeline of relevant events. Others involved private text messages discussing body image, scheduling, intimacy coordination, and production decisions. The consequence was subtle but structural. If sealed, portions of the factual sequence would be removed from public view while the surrounding claims remained active. That introduces the forward question. What happens when later disputes are evaluated without access to the steps that led there? At the center of the early sequence are exhibits numbered 42, 45, 47, 48, 53, 89, 95, 102, 133, 137, 146, and 148. Each corresponds to specific dates: February 16 and 17, 2023, early April, late May, spring moving into summer. When aligned chronologically, those dates intersect with text exchanges involving Justin Baldoni, references to Ryan Reynolds, mentions of Taylor Swift, and discussions connected to It Ends With Us. One February exchange, now publicly referenced, includes discussion of post-parting recovery, physical preparation, and scheduling body scenes later in production. The language frames acting as an athletic assignment and references a husband's perspective. It also includes reassurance from Baldoni regarding comfort and stress. These messages sit at the intersection of body image claims, collaboration, and later allegations, making their placement in the record significant. April entries correspond with intimacy coordinator discussions and rooftop scene exchanges. Texts from that period include references to writing credit history, creative authority, and the now well-known dragon language tied to Taylor Swift and Ryan Reynolds. The timing matters because it aligns with early creative disagreements and assertions of leverage. By late May, the sequence shifts toward grievances, Sony involvement, Angie Giannetti communications, assistant director complaints, and questions about whether formal HR action would proceed. These moments precede editing disputes, PGA credit discussions, and later marketing conflicts. Nothing here resolves the case, but the opening pattern is clear. A public signal in sealing motions, acquired consequence in what evidence may disappear, and a question that lingers as the record continues to unfold. The sequence establishes how timing, exhibits, and text messages began shaping not just claims, but visibility itself, before any ruling addressed substance. As the sealing requests move forward, their impact becomes less about privacy and more about structure. What remains visible begins to define how influence is understood. By classifying key communications as third-party material, the record is narrowed not by content, but by categorization. The result is that control, leverage, and escalation are filtered through what the court is asked to see, rather than when those moments occurred. The consequence of that framing is structural. By categorizing certain messages as third-party material, the focus shifts away from content and toward classification. The court is asked to decide not whether the messages matter, but whether they belong in public view at all. That distinction shapes what remains visible as the case progresses. February provides the earliest example. Messages from mid-February 2023 include discussions about physical readiness, recovery after childbirth, and production scheduling. Within those exchanges, Ryan Reynolds is referenced explicitly. The argument for sealing does not hinge on the topic of the discussion, but on the presence of a spouse characterized as lacking a substantial connection to the litigation. Yet those references occur in the same messages, later cited in claims about comfort, collaboration, and body-related concerns. April brings a different set of dynamics. Exhibits dated to that month include conversations about meeting with an intimacy coordinator and reactions to creative material, including the rooftop scene. In those texts, authority, creative input, and influence surface repeatedly. Taylor Swift is referenced not as a participant in production, but as a point of leverage and support. The language used frames her as a protector and creative barometer. The sealing request again emphasizes third-party privacy, even though the messages coincide with disputes central to the case narrative.
By May, the scope widens further. Late May exhibits correspond with communications involving Angie Janetti, Sony executives, assistant director complaints, wardrobe concerns, and discussions about whether grievances would proceed formally. These exchanges precede later disputes about editing control and marketing decisions. The third-party framing here encompasses crew members, executives, and intermediaries, broadening the category significantly. What emerges is a pattern. Each cluster of messages marked for sealing aligns with moments where control, leverage, or narrative positioning is discussed. The presence of third parties is consistent, but so is the relevance of timing. These are not stray messages. They appear at transitional points where collaboration shifts toward conflict. The structure matters because the court is not evaluating these messages in isolation. It is evaluating whether removing them alters the continuity of the record. When multiple phases of the timeline are filtered through the same sealing rationale, the effect compounds. This segment does not determine intent or outcome. It establishes something narrower but critical. The third-party argument is not applied to a single exchange. It is applied across phases of production, from early collaboration through escalating disputes. And that continuity sets the stage for how later control battles come into view, or out of view as the pace continues. As spring moves into early summer, the dispute crosses a quiet threshold. The question is no longer how collaboration functioned, but who controls what happens next. The dates tied to the sealing requests begin clustering around late April, mid-May, and early June, the precise window when post-production authority is typically established. That timing is not incidental. It marks the transition from participation to control. What changes here is not tone, but leverage. Communications from this period no longer focus on coordination. They focus on access, editing rooms, approval pathways, who is present and who is not. These are moments where creative disputes stop being theoretical and begin shaping outcomes. The effect of sealing at this stage is different. Earlier messages establish context. These messages establish direction. Removing them does not just narrow detail, it alters how later decisions appear to emerge. Several exhibits tied to this window involve intermediaries rather than principals. Todd Black appears as a relay point. Angie Janetti surfaces as a conduit instead of a collaborator. Sony is referenced in relation to boundaries around final cut authority. Each exchange reflects a tightening structure around post-production, even as direct communication narrows. Exhibits dated April 23rd and April 26th correspond with disputes over re-editing authority. Communications indicate that authorization was denied, and that the film remained under Wayfarer's final cut protections. These exchanges matter because they define limits, yet the sealing requests seek to remove them from public view using the same third-party framing applied earlier. Mid-May introduces a sharper turn. Messages dated May 17th and May 19th align with private screenings, test results, and early feedback, Shortly after, communications reference conditions tied to promotion and participation. These moments precede agreements about which version of the film would ultimately move forward, based on performance metrics. They also intersect with later disputes over creative ownership and responsibility. By June, the sequence expands into credit and marketing territory. Communications from June 19th reference PGA credit discussions. Later messages involve marketing strategy, premiere planning, and public statements. Ryan Reynolds appears again during this phase, now in connection with promotional positioning rather than production logistics. Once more, the rationale for sealing emphasizes third-party status, even as the content directly affects how the film will be released and framed. What ties this phase together is consistency. Each sealed cluster aligns with a control point: editing access, credit attribution, or promotional leverage. The court is not asked to assess whether those efforts were appropriate. It is asked whether the messages documenting them should remain visible. This segment does not resolve intent or outcome. It establishes a structural shift. By tracing the dates, the sequence shows how influence moved from collaboration into control, and how that movement becomes harder to see once key moments are filtered from the record. By the time the dispute reaches early summer, control is no longer exercised quietly. It begins to surface through positioning. What matters now is not just who made decisions, but how those decisions are presented once collaboration has already fractured. The timeline tightens, and visibility becomes strategic. At this stage, the dispute is no longer confined to production or post-production mechanics. It extends into messaging, release posture, and who speaks publicly, and under what conditions. The dates tied to the sealing requests begin intersecting with marketing timelines, premiere planning, and external communication. That alignment signals a shift from internal authority to public-facing consequence. The effect of sealing here is different from earlier phases. These messages do not explain how the conflict started. They explain how it is managed. Removing them does not erase disagreement. It alters how coordination, distance, and silence are interpreted as the film approaches release. As this phase unfolds, communication channels narrow further. Direct exchanges give way to intermediaries. Angie Janetti appears repeatedly as a relay rather than a participant. Messages reference availability instead of collaboration. The shift is subtle but telling. Decisions are still being made, but fewer voices are present when they are finalized. Exhibits tied to late June and July focus on marketing coordination, premiere logistics, and public statements. These are not background details. They determine how the film will be introduced, who will represent it, and what tone will accompany its release. Ryan Reynolds appears in this phase in relation to promotional posture and timing. Once again, the justification for sealing rests on third-party framing, even though the substance shapes public perception. What emerges is an asymmetry. Earlier disagreements about creative input and editing authorities set the stage. Now, the consequences of those disagreements are external. The public-facing outcome is visible, while the negotiations that shaped it are increasingly filtered out of the record. The court is not asked at this stage to evaluate whether these strategies were appropriate. It is asked whether the communications documenting them should remain visible. That procedural decision carries weight because it determines how the final phase of the timeline will be understood. This segment does not assign motive or fault. It establishes progression. As the dispute moves from internal control to external presentation, the record becomes narrower at the very moments when coordination matters most. What remains is outcome without full process. By the time attention turns toward formal positioning and eventual rulings, much of the connective tissue has already been reduced. The question that follows is not only what decisions were made, but how much of the path leading there is still visible once the sequence reaches its public end. By this stage, the effects of earlier filtering begin to surface in how responsibility is perceived. The dispute is no longer unfolding in real time, it is being reconstructed from what remains visible. With multiple phases partially obscured, later decisions appear detached from their origins. The timeline still exists, but its connective logic is thinner, and that changes how accountability is understood. What becomes central here is attribution. Communications tied to credit, authorship, and contribution are among those flagged for removal. Discussions involving PGA credit, editorial presence, and creative input are categorized as peripheral third-party exchanges. Yet these same discussions underpin later claims about who shaped the final film and how those contributions were recognized. When filtered out, attribution appears settled rather than contested. The same pattern applies to escalation. Early messages emphasize alignment and shared objectives. Over time, communications introduce conditions, limits, and leverage tied to participation. When intermediate steps are sealed, that escalation can appear sudden or unmotivated. The record begins closer to conflict than cooperation, even though the sequence itself was gradual. Individual roles are also reshaped by this narrowing. Ryan Reynolds appears intermittently across the timeline, first as a referenced spouse, later in discussions connected to marketing and public posture. Taylor Swift appears in creative framing language associated with support and influence. By consistently classifying these references as third-party material, the record minimizes how often those figures are invoked at inflection points, flattening the portrayal of influence. This has procedural consequences. Courts assess credibility and consistency by tracing sequences.
When portions of that sequence are unavailable, interpretation relies more heavily on summaries and characterizations rather than primary communications. That does not resolve disputes, but it alters how claims are weighed. By this point, the cumulative effect is visible. Later actions carry disproportionate interpretive weight because earlier context has been reduced. Decisions about promotion, credit, and participation appear as endpoints rather than results of negotiation. This segment does not argue that sealing is improper. It shows how repetition changes impact. One sealed exchange limits detail. Multiple sealed exchanges across phases reshape narrative structure. The difference is incremental but decisive. As the case advances, what remains visible increasingly defines how responsibility is assigned. Whether claims ultimately succeed or fail, they will be evaluated within a record that has already been narrowed through procedural choices. And that narrowing influences not just outcomes, but how the sequence leading to them is remembered. By the time the record reaches its final phase, the dispute is no longer defined by what is argued, but by what remains visible. The question is no longer who said what first, or even who was right. It becomes how the sequence itself will be remembered once procedural decisions have narrowed the frame. At this point, continuity matters more than conclusion. Across each phase, the same pattern has repeated. Early collaboration appears in fragments, transitional moments are filtered, later conflicts remain clearer. The timeline does not disappear, but it compresses. When that happens, interpretation shifts. Actions taken near the end of the sequence begin to carry disproportionate weight because their origins are less accessible. This matters because litigation does not unfold in isolation. It unfolds alongside narrative formation. Once portions of the record are removed, explanations rely more heavily on characterization than chronology. That does not determine accuracy, it determines emphasis. And emphasis shapes how responsibility, intent, and credibility are perceived. What distinguishes this case is not a single sealed message, but repetition. Requests to seal consistently align with control points, creative authority, editing access, credit attribution, promotional leverage. Each moment builds on the last. When those moments are filtered out, the connective tissue thins, even if outcomes remain visible. At this stage, no ruling has resolved those tensions. The court has not weighed intent or assigned fault. What has occurred is quieter. The structure of the record has already been shaped ahead of any final determination. That shaping influences how later evidence will be read, not by altering facts, but by narrowing context. The significance is structural rather than dramatic. A record that preserves sequence allows observers to follow escalation. A record that removes transitions emphasizes endpoints. Neither resolves the dispute on its own, but each produces a different understanding of how events unfolded. As the case moves toward resolution, what survives procedural filtering will frame how decisions are remembered. Whether claims succeed or fail, they will do so within a narrative that has already been curated through visibility choices. That reality persists beyond filings and arguments. If this breakdown was useful, the next phase of this story will matter even more, because what follows rarely shows up in headlines. It appears in sequence, in timing, in what remains consistent once attention moves on. This isn't a moment that resolves all at once, it's one that continues to shift, and stories like this tend to reveal the most after certainty fades.